Let's turn to Daniel chapter 11. Daniel chapter 11, and we're going to look at verses 21 through 31 tonight. Last week, I gave you a handout, and in there I explained the breakdown of chapter 11, and I'd like to start off this evening by asking a question. The tribulation period, so when we looked at Daniel's, in the 9th chapter of his vision there, he broke down time into 3 separate periods. There was the first 7 weeks, which we know led up all the way up to Nehemiah and the completion of the rebuilding of the city. We looked at the next 62 weeks, which led us all the way to Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem, and then after that he was cut off, which would be his crucifixion. And then we saw that there was 1 week left, and it's known by various names. One of them would be Jacob's trouble. The time of Jacob's trouble is one name. We commonly refer to it as the tribulation period. So what I want to ask you tonight, and because I want to try to work our thought process a little bit, and I want to ask you this question, and that is, how would you define the tribulation period? What does it, when you think tribulation, what do you think of?
Trouble.
Sure. But specifically, tell me, first of all, tell me who's in trouble, who's causing the trouble, and when does the trouble start?
Starts after 3.5 years.
Very good. You're absolutely correct.
Yeah.
That is an important point right there. So, it starts after 3.5 years, and we're going to see that tonight. Second question is, who's in trouble?
I think pretty much
Israel.
everybody that's left on this earth.
So, Israel,
Yes.
you say Israel specifically. You
Right.
say anybody that's on the earth.
Pretty much.
Anybody that's left on the earth. I don't leave that out. That's fine.
Yeah.
All right? Any other answers to that?
The church.
The church? Okay? So we have the church, people of the earth, Israel. Anybody else? Okay? And who's causing the trouble?
The Antichrist.
The Antichrist.
Yeah, the Antichrist.
Antichrist.
One of the common misconceptions, if you hear people talk about the tribulation period, one of the common misconceptions that people oftentimes will cite is that it's God pouring out his wrath during that period. And make no mistake, God does pour out his wrath,
Amen.
but it doesn't happen until the very, very end. The trouble is brought about by the Antichrist.
Right.
Most everything that happens, if you were to take that 7 years, and I'm not going to try to break it down into months, but the first 3.5 years is characterized by what?
Peace.
Relative peace. Yeah. For who?
Israel.
Israel. Yes. That's important. The second 3.5 years is characterized by trouble, first focused intensely on Israel, and then second of all on those who support Israel or those who have the testimony of Jesus Christ. And then Jesus comes back, and there's some wrath in there, which we won't even touch on in the book of Daniel, but we do touch upon it in the book of Revelation. When we get there, we talk about the vials being poured out, things like that. All that's important. And the reason I say that is because when we look at the 11th chapter, one of the things that if you'll note in your handout that I said, and that is that the first thing is the emergence of the little horn before the tribulation. That's found in verses 11 through 30 through 31. Either way. And the reason I say it that way is because I'm not saying it's the emergence of the Antichrist before the 7 years. What I'm saying, it's before a defining moment when tribulation starts. Now let me ask you one more follow-up question, and that is, what is the defining moment that will mark the start of the actual trouble the focus trouble that we anticipate because of Scripture.
Not sacrificing the animals and the desecration of.
That yes, it's the abomination that causes desolation. That event is so critically important. And let me just say this, and I'll say this at the outset, and you'll see. By the time we get to that point, and the question that would logically need to be asked is, if we see that, will we not know?
We should know. If our eyes are open, we
We should know.
We should know.
But why do you think that people won't know or will not accept that he is the
Because he's
Antichrist?
going to be charismatic, I think. I mean, the first 3.5 years, people are going to love him and adore him and bow down to him because he says he's God. He puts himself higher than God. So there's going to be a lot of people that are going to fall into that facade.
Because they haven't studied.
Yeah, and there's a lot
God's
of people
word.
out there that might go to church, but that's all they're doing.
Yeah.
Well,
It's just
there's a
going
lot
to
that
church.
happens before he comes with wars and rumors of wars and natural
Right.
things, natural phenomenon. If you have this world player coming on bringing about peace and promising better things, I think it's natural for people to flock to somebody like that if they're not studying,
Yeah,
looking for something better.
right.
All that is true in some form, right? And you combine it all up, and what you get is a individual who comes on the scene that seems to be a Gandhi-style kind of person that everybody embraces, even though during that time, and what we're going to see tonight, during that time, prior to the abomination of desolation, he's attacking Egypt. He's attacking nations in North Africa. We're going to see all that tonight in the lesson. He's doing all these things, but because he has built, first of all, a coalition within the Muslim nations, he's going to then go out and attack those nations that actually support Israel. And you ask yourself, why? Here's the interesting thing. Up until this year, there's only been one nation, one major nation, maybe two, that has acknowledged Israel's existence. The main one has been Egypt, and that actually, Egypt and Israel have had a long-standing relation that goes all the way back to the days of Jimmy Carter. When you think about it, when you think about what he was doing, and it started then, and then certainly when President Reagan came on, and then you had the Camp David Accord, Egypt is intricately linked and has acknowledged Israel's existence and their right to exist for some time. Two nations, actually, if you look at it from a geopolitical perspective, there are two nations that rely upon Israel's existence for their very own existence in some sense, and that is Egypt and Jordan. And the reason that they do is because they have a military alliance and they have an intelligence alliance. Remember that Egypt today is not run by a government, but Egypt today is under military rule. It goes all the way back to the Arab Spring that happened a while back. And you had that big uprising in Egypt, and the government or the military stepped in, and the military today is running Egypt. And why do I mention Egypt so much? Because they are mentioned in the lesson tonight. And it's important to understand that. Before we get into the 11th chapter, though, turn me over to, I want to remind you of a few things. So turn over to the book of Revelation. And we're going to look at chapter 12. And then we're going to look at chapter 13, because chapter 13 is almost a parallel chapter to what we're going to be reading in Daniel chapter 11 tonight. And I'll just remind you of a few things in chapter 12. Remember, verse 7 says that there was a war in heaven, and Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels, and prevailed not, neither was their place found any more in heaven. So what happens is Satan tries to rise up again, and there is a war in heaven. Remember that Satan has the ability today to enter into the third heaven. He's been doing that since time began. Remember in the book of Job, when it says there that Satan came before God. Now, was God on the earth? Was God in heaven? I don't know. But Satan had the ability to go into the very presence of God and have a conversation with him. Remember what Paul wrote in the book of Ephesians when he says, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." Where is Satan today? He has, one person put it this way, he has a side room in heaven that's his domain. I don't know if that's true or not, but I thought it was an interesting way of putting it, but just from a conceptual perspective, right? But certainly in chapter 12, he's kicked out of heaven. Remember that as he's kicked out, he then goes, and what does he do? He tries to destroy Israel. He has been trying to destroy Israel since God chose him as a nation. It makes you almost wonder if he wasn't lurking around a corner when God said to Abram, "Leave Ur, I will make you a great nation." I don't know if he was or not. But remember that since that time, and certainly as it got even deeper with Ishmael, right, son of Hagar, who was Isaac's half-brother, since that time, they have been mortal enemies. And they have been, Israel has had to stand their ground, and all these nations that have sprung forth from Ishmael and others have tried to destroy her. Where do they get that thought from? Where do they get that jealousy from? Where do they get that hatred from? It comes from Satan himself. And Satan is going to use the Antichrist one final time to try to destroy Israel. So let's look at chapter 13. And he says, "And I stood," this is John speaking, in chapter 13. He says, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea." You know, think about this. How many times have we seen beasts in Daniel's visions? There is a correlation there. This beast is the same as the fourth beast that Daniel saw when he says, "I want to know more about the fourth beast because he's the worst of all," right? He goes on to say, and he says, and look at his description, 7 heads, 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. The language is so interesting, and I mean that's why I started in Daniel, because it would be easy for us to start in Revelation and try to refer back to Daniel, but if Daniel is really the heart of prophecy that the New Testament writers used, isn't it important to understand Daniel? And then we can go and understand what Jesus said in Matthew 24. We can go and understand what Paul said in 2 Thessalonians. We can go and understand what John wrote in the book of Revelation and have a foundation to fall back on. All right, so this language in verse 1 is, oh my goodness, this is spot on to what we have seen in Daniel's vision. "And the beast, which I saw, was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority." And I want you to stop right there, and I want you to think about this. The dragon is Satan. Satan gives Antichrist his power, his seat, which is his dominion, and his authority. What is Satan's dominion today? Aside from his spot in heaven, what is his dominion today? The earth is his dominion. Yeah, matter of fact, in 2 Corinthians 4:4, it says, "In whom the God of this world hath blinded the minds of them which believe not, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine upon them." So just remember that it is the God. He is the God of this world. It was man's dominion given to Adam by God, and when Adam sinned, he gave that dominion and that power to Satan. And when Jesus comes back, just as a side note, FYI, good news, he's taking it back, right? But verse 2 is really important, because he says, "And the dragon gave him his power and his seat, which is his dominion, and great authority." Verse 3, "And I saw one of his heads, as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wonder after the beast." I don't know what the deadly wound is. I don't know what that means. We may know. We will know when we see it. You can speculate all you want. There's not enough information in the Bible, but what we can say is that when it says all the world wondered after the beast, all the world marveled. It doesn't say all the world followed, but it says all the world. Well, when I was studying this, I thought he is going to be the talk of the world. He is going to dominate the news. He is going to dominate social media. He is going to dominate the thought process. And as much as we've talked about COVID and everything else, that's what he's going to dominate the conversation. That doesn't mean all the world will follow him, but he will definitely do, because all the world will wonder after him. And in verse 4, it says, and they worshiped the dragon which gave power to the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like unto the beast, who is able to make war with him? So obviously, there are going to be those who just embrace him and worship him. And they're going to ask the question, who is able to fight against him? There's going to be an aura of invincibility. Kind of like 3 years ago when people were trying to beat the Patriots in football, right? This seems much. I mean, and I joke, but it is just going to be. I would liken it to this. Remember when, in 1939, when Adolf Hitler invaded Poland? There was no war in Poland. He walked in and he walked in and took it. They laid down their arms. I mean, there was resistance, don't get me wrong. But I mean, there was no battle. I mean, he walked in and basically took it. And that's because why? Because there was an aura of invincibility about him, and it was so fast and so fluid and so quick that they didn't do anything. And as we will see, the Antichrist, there are some similarities between the way that the Antichrist will move in throughout the Middle East and the way that Adolf Hitler did around Europe. It's very, very interesting. That I'm not saying Adolf Hitler is the Antichrist. What I'm saying is he is a type. He is one of those. Remember, we say the spirit of iniquity already works, right? He is an evil. He was an evil person. Antiochus Epiphanes was an evil person, right? There have been other evil people in the world, and there's the spirit of Antichrist about them, but they are not the Antichrist. He is yet to come. All right, verse 5. And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. Whoa! Where have we seen that before? 42 months. How long is that? 3.5 years. And it's the last 3.5 years. When does the Antichrist truly get his power? At the abomination of desolation. Remember, and who gives him that power? Satan does. But who allows Satan to give him that power? God does. God does. We've already seen that, right? All right, verse 6. And we're not going to cover all these in details. I'm just trying to give you some highlights. And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God. Remember, we've seen that in Daniel's visions. Every time we've seen the Antichrist, he has always stood up and he's always blasphemed God. Yeah. Always. And we've seen this over and over again. And he has declared himself to be God. He opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell in heaven. His name, his tabernacle, and all those that are in heaven. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints. Saints. Now, I know some will try to make this tribulation saints. I don't see it. That's one of the reasons why I think that the church is here. We see it in verse 12. We see it here. We've seen it back in Daniel. We've seen in Daniel where he makes war with the saints, right? And to overcome them. Now, this is interesting. He makes war with the saints, and he is allowed to overcome them. Think about that. Think about that. And power was given him over all kindred and tongues and nations. We do not need to fear the wrath of God. But we do need to worry about the wrath of Satan and Antichrist. Amen. And one of the things, and why I believe this has been revealed in this way, is to warn us. Is to warn us. Is to let us know. Remember, it's interesting because in chapter 12, it talks about the saints overcoming the Antichrist. Here, the Antichrist overcomes the saints. How do we win against the Antichrist? How do we win? If he's been given power to overcome the saints, how do we win against him?
Only through
Stand
Christ.
firm in our faith.
Yes, we must stand for our faith.
Amen.
It's the only way. How did Jesus overcome Satan in the wilderness?
His faith.
His faith.
God's
His
word.
God's word, right? The only way that we will win is if we stand for the faith regardless of
That's right.
the circumstances. You know what? That's not a new concept. Stephen, when he was preaching to the Jews, had to stand for his faith, the consequence of which he was stoned to death. In the 1st century AD, all of the apostles died a martyr's death with the exception of John. You get into the 2nd century AD, and you're going to see people being burned at the stake. You're going to see people throughout the Dark Ages being drawn and quartered. You know what that means? They were tied between 4 horses and pulled apart. You will read stories about the churches, regarding the churches of the Valley of Piedmont, where mothers and fathers would not recant their faith and had to watch their children die in hot burning oil. Now, I've heard people say, and let me say, this is even going to be worse than that. And I've heard people say God would not allow us to go through that. He's already allowed us to go through that.
Oh, yeah.
It's already happened. We have lived for 200 plus years in America in relative safety and peace. But that's not always been the case in the world. And that's not always the case in the world today. And so, and yes, it's going to be worse. But notice what he says there. We see in the theology of this rising beast, this study. Remember I said last week, we need to talk about Antichrist more. We need to study about him more. We need to study the movements, the events that are happening more and more. Why? Because the theology of the rising beast, this Antichrist that is to rise, is a call for an endurance and a patience of the saints. It's a call to us to endure. It's a call to us to be patient and wait for the coming of the Lord. Right? It is an exhortation not to get. It's not like you got to. It's not like we got to go and draw up the most beautiful end time charts in the world. That's not what God wants us to do. That's not what Jesus is asking us to do. What Jesus is asking us to do is to get our awareness up and to look for the signs. And that's why we've been studying this, is to understand what the signs are, right? Notice what he says, and all that dwell on the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. If any man have an ear, let him hear. He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with sword. Here is the patience and faith of the saints. What he's saying there, if you're taken into captivity, go. If you're killed with the sword, give your life. That's what he says. Because why? Because that is a demonstration of your patience in waiting for the Lord and your faith in Jesus Christ.
Amen.
And that is the only way that we win. And that's why I said you cannot just flip a switch, see the Antichrist, flip a switch, and all of a sudden become the most faithful, God-fearing servant in the world. It has got to be a habit today. It has got to be ingrained in your DNA today. It has got to be it's got to encompass your life today, because if it's not, at the first sign of trouble, look what's already happened. We've got people who could be here on Sundays are not here.
Right.
And they're living in fear. And I get the fear. I understand that. And some have a legitimate reason, but others could be here if they wanted to be.
Right.
And I know this is happening throughout the nation. As I've talked to different pastors and chatted with them, attendance is down drastically, even in places that don't have the restrictions.
Yeah.
So, anyway, all right, let's go back to Daniel chapter 11. Now let's look at some events. So, Daniel 11, 21 through 31 is the events that are going to happen leading up to the last 42 months of the tribulation period. Verse 21 says, "And in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and attain the kingdom by flatteries." So, in his estate means in his place. So, there is a transition here. There is a transition between verse 20 and verse 21. I will tell you that there is a parallel as well in how Antiochus Epiphanes came to the throne in the Seleucid Empire. There is similarities, and Antiochus Epiphanes would be a type of the Antichrist. But remember what I said, the pronouns have to match. And if we get down through verse 37, and we see that everyone starting in verse 36 says that's definitely the Antichrist, the pronouns have to match and it flows. So while many have ascribed this to Antiochus Epiphanes because there are similarities, he certainly rose to power without lineage, right? And without the rightful heir to the throne. This is describing the Antichrist, and we'll see that as we go through. "In his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give honor of the kingdom." So as you look at this thought process, what he is saying there is that the Antichrist will take the place of someone before him. And the idea here of flatteries is that he's going to lie, he's going to manipulate, he is going to pull strings through a coalition of nations to rise to power.
Right.
That's what he's going to do. Remember we talked about that leading up to that. He doesn't have a kingdom of his own. He doesn't have a lineage to a kingdom. And yet because of events, geopolitical events, he is going to rise to power. And we saw in one of Daniel's visions that the 10 kings all acquiesce and give him power. Right? And then in verse 22, it says there, in verse 20, and with the arms of a flood shall they be overthrown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. And so there is going to be, as you look at this, and let's just read down through verse 23 as well. "And after the league is made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people." So when you look at this, there's going to be an alliance. There's going to be a treaty or a pact, right? And in this treaty and pact, he's going to gather these nations. And it says a league or an alliance is made with him, and he shall work deceitfully. He's going to say one thing, and his intention is going to be something completely different. And deceitfulness, for he shall come up and shall become strong. But he's not going to have a large army. He's only going to have a small army, and yet he's going to rise to this power. In verse 24, "And he shall enter peaceably, even upon the fattest places of the province, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey and spoil and riches, yea, he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds even for a time." And so, what is he doing? He's going to plunder land. He's going to take possessions. He's going to take the most prosperous places for himself. He's going to go throughout the Middle East is the region there, right? And when it says here that it talks about forecast his devices, right? It's a very interesting phrase because it means that he is going to make plans to eliminate strongholds. And that's what he says there in the verse there, because he says, and he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds. He is going to try his best to destroy military power. That's what he's talking about there. He doesn't want any opposition. He doesn't want anybody to stand up to him. But remember, he's only got a small force, and he's working with a coalition. He is going to be very decisive, and many will try to stand up against him, and yet he will still crush them. Why? Because he has an alliance following him. And it's very interesting because if you look at that verse there, it says that they will actually give over to him, and they will be afraid of him because they fear him. They say no one can stand up against him. We saw that in Revelation 13, verse 25. And he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south. And here's where we've made a lot of the Greek Empire when it divided into four. And I've said that the king of the north is the Seleucids, which encompasses Syria, Turkey, and those areas. The king of the south has always been referred to as Egypt. I don't have time to take you there tonight, but if you study Ezekiel 38 and 39, you just go read them. I think you'll find that the Antichrist is going to come out of the Syria, Turkey region. He's going to be part of that northern kingdom. And he's going to go and he's going to fight against the king of the south, which is Egypt. It's very interesting. So I want you to think about this. I said in the beginning of class, the lesson tonight, I don't want to call it class, in the beginning of the lesson that Egypt was the first country to make peace with Israel. And they've had this alliance for 20, 30 years, right? And he is going to go and he's going to make war with Egypt. And that's what it says there in verse 25. And he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. So the king of the south is going to fight, but he's not going to stand. Why? Because it's going to be there's traitors in his midst. Is what that verse says. There are people there that are going to betray him. There are people there that are going to turn over and do all they can to align themselves with the Antichrist, right? So it's interesting. This is a remember what Jesus said in Matthew 24, that there will be wars and rumors of wars. These are all signs, but the end is not yet. Let me tell you that if you see a war in Egypt, it is a sign. Now, I could be totally off base. I could. I don't think that I am. In my studies, this is what I've been led to believe. And again, we're not date setting because we don't know where that falls. Right? We don't know, but there will be a Middle East, there will be turmoil in the Middle East. And one of the turmoil is a king in Syria, or the north from Turkey, Syria, is going to go and they're going to go fight against Egypt. Remember what I said last week, that there is been a vacuum or a void of genuine leadership in the Middle East. There were 4 dominant leaders in the Middle East. They're all gone. Others have risen to power, but they do not command the same attention or coalition that those the other leaders commanded in the Middle East. Goes on to say in verse 27. Let's see. Verse 26. And yea, they that feed of the portion of his meat shall destroy him, and his army shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain. So again, it's part of that inner circle of the king of the south will be a coup, right? And his armies will be swept away. Verse 27 says, and let's read verse 27, verse 20. And both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief. They're both evil, right? Mm-hmm. And they shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. Why? They're not going to fully succeed because the end is not yet. It's not time for the end. And it goes on to say in verse 20, and then shall he return. So the king of the north is going to return into his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant. That is a powerful statement. And he shall do exploits and return to his own land. Within the next 4 verses, we're going to see this holy covenant mentioned multiple times. Let me ask you a question. What does the holy covenant refer to? I already told you once.
Covenant between God and Israel?
So I would take it even back a little bit further, Sister Lee, and I would go, it's the covenant that God made with Abraham.
Okay, yeah.
It's the Abrahamic covenant. That is the Holy Covenant. That covenant is still in force today. And you and I, as servants of Christ, have been grafted into that covenant.
Yes.
We've been made a part of that covenant. And so what does it say there? He shall return to his land. He's going to have riches. His heart is going to. He's fought the king of the south. They had made if I understand the geopolitical nature of this, Egypt made an alliance. Other nations have made an alliance with Israel. Matter of fact, today there are 4 nations today that have normalized relationships with Israel. It is United Arab Emirates, Sudan, Morocco, and can't think of the 4th one. Dang it. Vice President Pence is traveling to Israel next week. And in his travels, they have said, they've kind of leaked it, that another 1 or 2 nations will normalize relations with Israel. Think about the nations that are doing it, though, right? It's that Sunni versus Shia issue. And I think Saudi Arabia will eventually do it. And remember that the hardliners, the Irans of the world, the Syrias of the world, those that support Hamas in Palestine. You know, Egypt is next to Israel fighting against Hamas in Palestine today. And it's those nations, and all this geopolitical thing is happening, and I'm not an expert at it. I mean, it's giving you a very high-level general understanding of what's happening in the Middle East. But Egypt and Israel and other nations are fighting against Hamas because of what they're doing. And I mean, they're a bunch of terrorists bombing people, right? And so, but they're supported. Their biggest support comes from Syria and Iran and Turkey. And it's those nations that will fight. And why are they going to fight? Because these nations have made an alliance. He hates Israel. Satan hates Israel. Israel is God's chosen people. As I said, I'm wondering if Satan didn't overhear God say to Abraham, I am going to make you great. And what was Lucifer's desire? His desire was to be great, to be God.
Yes.
Right? To be greater. It's just, to me it makes sense. He goes on to say there, in verse 28, and then shall he return to his land. He's going to take his riches, but his heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he shall do exploits and return into his holy land. He's going to, in verse 29, at that time, and at the time appointed, he shall return and come towards the south. But it shall not be as the former or as the latter. Did I skip it? No. So he's going to turn and go to the south again. He's going to go try to fight the king of the south again. But he says it's not the same. Why? For the ships of Chittim shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. I don't know who Chittim is. What I will tell you, there are some who say that Cyprus potentially. What I do know is this. What I can say for certainty is this. He's going to turn and come back to fight Egypt, and there's going to be a naval blockade. And that naval blockade is going to say, look, you need to knock it off. There's too much turmoil in the Middle East. And so what does he do? He turns around and he goes back. And he goes back, and when he goes back, he does what? He turns his anger again towards Israel, and he takes those who are in alliance with him, and he takes them, and he begins to extract intelligence information. They here are plotting against Israel, because that is the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to destroy Israel, but we are still not at the middle of the week yet.
No.
So all of these events are happening prior to the middle of the week. And it says in verse 31, and arms shall stand on his part, And they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and they shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. Now we are in the middle of the week. Verse 31. Verse 31 puts us at that point. Verse 31 takes us to what happened in Revelation chapter 12. Verse 31 takes us to what happened when Jesus said, when you hear Daniel speak of the abomination of desolation, he's referring to verse 31 of Daniel chapter 11. And that's why I say that this cannot, in part, cannot be Antiochus Epiphanes, because Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation, know and understand. He says, when you see it, not when you saw it. Right? If this was referring to Antiochus Epiphanes, he would have said, it already happened, don't worry about it. So that only leaves us two conclusions. One, it either has to be Titus in 70 AD, which we've already proven cannot be, because Titus died right after that, and Jesus wasn't the one that killed him. Well, he probably did, but not with the brightness of his coming. So that leads us to the conclusion that it can only be future. It hasn't happened yet. And so we're going to stop there. What I will say, military forces from Antichrist, military forces will come into Jerusalem, and they will take away the temple sacrifices. But if they take away the temple sacrifices, what has to happen before they take away the temple sacrifice?
You have to start sacrificing.
They have to start sacrificing. They have to have a temple.
Yeah. They don't have a temple.
Not yet. Not yet. I did see it, FYI, I did see it very interesting. Most people think that the temple is next to, or kind of butted up against where the Dome of the Rock is. I saw an interesting video of right outside of Jerusalem, right outside of the modern day Jerusalem, one walls, just right next to where the Dome of the Rock is what they call the City of David. And this person and many in Israel believe that that's where the temple actually was. And it's open land. So it's interesting. I don't know. Doesn't matter. What I'd say, there will be a temple. Now remember, they got to set the cornerstone. They set the cornerstone, they can set the altar, because the sacrifices took place outside of the temple. They did not happen in the temple. They didn't sacrifice inside the building. They sacrificed outside. So once they set the cornerstone, they can begin to sacrifice. And again, that's a sign, right? That's a sign. And all these things lead up to the end. And Jesus said, look for the signs. And I've heard, it's so long I've heard people say, well, we don't need to know because we won't be here. Let me tell you something. Whether we're here or not, when Jesus says, look for the signs, I'm going to tell you, look for the signs.
Right.
When you see the abomination of desolation, know and understand there's about 42 months left. And we know, based upon Daniel and the timing that we saw in chapter 9, that the beginning of sacrifices actually starts inside of that 7-year period of time. Remember, the angel talked about time frames, and we looked at it, and we talked about that, and it happens somewhere roughly a year to a year and a half into that window of time. Again, no man knows the day nor the hour. That's what Jesus said. But it is up to, and so I don't know the day, I don't know the hour, but I can tell you that if we're here and we see these events, we're going to know the timing. We're going to know in close proximity what the timing is. And Jesus told us to look for it, to understand it. All right. So next week we'll pick it up in verse 31, verse 32, and we will talk about the events that happened in the last 42 months. Questions or comments? Keep praying. Remember Daniel's key to understanding visions and prophecy. Pray, fast, seek His will and His leadership and study.
I think it's been really interesting to tie it into just secular history. I mean, there is no such thing as secular history. It's all history. It's all the events that are leading to Christ's return.
Yep.
Whether it seems like it's related to Israel or it isn't, it's all setting the stage. Hitler set the stage, things like that.
Absolutely.
When we talk about that, I had a professor at Texas Tech that would talk about, he stayed with a woman that had lived through the Holocaust in Germany. And he said, couldn't you tell? Didn't you know what was going on? And she said, Dr. Bell, of course I knew. My husband knew. And she said, he said, couldn't you tell when your Jewish neighbors started disappearing? Wasn't it obvious? And she said, of course it was obvious, but he put my Fritz to work. He gave my husband a job. And so we looked the other way because we had food on our table.
Yeah.
And I think that, when we get desperate, the things that we turn a blind eye to.
That's an excellent point, right? And with all of the turmoil going on, remember, he's going to rise to power not in a flashy way.
No.
He's going to rise to power deceitfully. He's going to rise up, and then he's going to start expanding. Then he's going to start. Now, there is a mortal wound. I don't know what that is. Who knows? But what I will say, and when we study Revelation, there's going to be another powerful force in the world that is going to give him voice. That's going to give him his.
Sorry.
It's going to be a witness for him. Well, by the way, one of the interesting things is that don't forget that the Antichrist hates Israel. The Antichrist hates the church. But you realize that even in you study Revelation, the harlot is going to give and acquiesce to the Antichrist. And in the end, the Antichrist is even going to hate the harlot. He's going to use his evil personified, his evil magnified is not, certainly he most likely will use religion in some way to rise, in part to rise to power, but it's a means to an end. It is not a conviction. Our following Jesus is not a means to an end, it is a conviction.
Right.
It's totally opposite of what Antichrist is. All right, any other word? Do we have any prayer requests?